I want to talk to you today about traditional sexual morality. Traditional sexual morality begins after the fall of Rome. Uh, Traditionally, we would say that the fall of Rome occurs in 494 AD. What happens then is Rome is an empire. Rome has dominated all of Europe, northern Africa, parts of the Middle East. The range of its kingdom, of its empire, is just gigantic. Any country that ends up conquering other countries and becoming what we would call an empire brings a great amount of stability, not necessarily good, but stability to the region. And everyone in that region must learn that country's language, its culture, its history, its religion. It becomes dominant throughout. Well, obviously, then when the empire falls apart, that stability literally evaporates. Everybody goes back to what I call their tribal roots. That's important to understand. When I use the word tribal, I'm not talking about headhunters or cannibals. Most people in this world still today have ties to what they call tribes. Tribes are defined by language, by culture, and by history. For example, one of the reasons that Iraq is probably never going to work is because it's made up of three tribes. It's made up of Kurds that really tie themselves to present-day Turkey, which previously was the Ottoman Empire. It also has Shiites who were tied to Iran, which previously was the Persian Empire, and then it has Sunnis who are Arabs, which were part of the Arabian Empire. They have nothing in common. Trying to put them together within a geographical boundary and call that boundary Iraq, and expect them to work together is really a hopeless task, because people still want to go back to their roots, their tribal roots. So when Rome dissolves its empire, when the empire is dissolved, all of Europe goes back to their tribal roots. There's the Goths and the Visigoths. You have the people who eventually become part of Scotland and Ireland and Wales and England. The people in Spain, people in Portugal. All these people go back to their tribal roots. Another thing that happens when empires are dissolved is that for the most part knowledge is destroyed. They're so tired of being under the domain of this empire and having to learn what they want you to learn, they just go back to their tribal roots, and the rest of this knowledge is irrelevant. And so in Europe, what happened when the Roman Empire collapsed was we go into what's called the Dark Ages. It's a period where knowledge literally is destroyed. It's not around. People are literally trying to survive. There's famines, there's plagues. And after a certain period of time, stability starts to come back. There are local tribes within a tribal area that begin to dominate the other local tribes that they know. For example, in Scotland, maybe there were 10 or 15 tribes, and they start to come together under one Scottish heading. The same thing in Ireland and Wales. The same thing happened in France and in Germany. And so we moved from the Dark Ages to the Middle Ages. And then finally, at the end of the Middle Ages, we moved into what's called the Renaissance in France, or the Age of Enlightenment, where now knowledge is suddenly on the uptake. Science is given birth in Western Europe. We call it clockwork science. We become aware of the laws of physics, and mathematics again, and science becomes very prevalent as it is even today. Now, during that period of time, there was one institution that was able to safeguard the known knowledge that Rome had accumulated and developed. And that institution, that entity, was called the Catholic Church. It's very important that we have this knowledge, we have this information. This is not a religious comment, it's a historical comment. What happens then is that Europe goes through the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages and emerges into the Age of Enlightenment, or the Renaissance in France. This knowledge then becomes valuable, and people want to have access to this knowledge. Well, we have to acknowledge the fact that the church was the repository of this known knowledge, controlled it, and they had a investment in how they wanted it distributed and understood. For example, there was a gentleman named Ptolemy who mathematically was able to prove that the Earth was the center of the known universe. The only problem with that mathematical formula is that the Earth is not the center of the known universe. It's not even the center of our solar system. But mathematically, he proved it. The mathematics was very difficult, but nevertheless, it was a valid proof. During the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, Copernicus comes along and he simplifies the mathematics. And he says, you know what? He says, the Earth is not the center of the universe. The sun is the center of the solar system. We call it heliocentrism. And his mathematics was much simpler, and it proved his point as well. Well, obviously, later on, we were able to verify that the sun is the center of our solar system. Now, why would Ptolemy want to prove that the Earth is the center of the universe? Well, you have to remember, and this is a historical comment, not a religious comment, it's not a negative comment at all. The church is the repository of all the known knowledge of the Western world. And for them, one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental tenet, is that God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth is central to God's plan of creation. Therefore, the earth must be the center of the universe. Ptolemy is greatly influenced by his Catholic faith. And so he takes that knowledge and interprets it in light of his faith, mathematically proves it. It's just that the math is obviously incorrect. Later on, Copernicus is able to prove that, and we're able to verify it in the modern age when we leave the planet and we can send satellites out into the solar system, and we now know that we all revolve around the giant planet called the sun. Because of the church's influence, therefore, they are able to take that influence and direct it in the direction of what we call sexual morality. Now, what they did is they discovered Aristotle's teleological principles of nature. Now, Aristotle did not invent the traditional sexual morality. What he did is he talked about the teleological aspects of nature. He realized that everything in nature has a purpose. Everything in nature has a purpose. Every living thing in nature has a purpose. Everything does something for some reason, eating, sleeping, whatever those purposes are. And therefore, everything in nature has an essential aspect of its nature that allows for its purpose to be fulfilled. And therefore, everything in nature has a proper function that allows for that essential aspect to be performed so that its purpose can be completed. If we sit down and think about it, the most fundamental purpose of everything in nature is to reproduce. One species ceases to reproduce, the species becomes extinct. Now, the Catholic Church took that basic teleological approach, purpose-driven approach to nature that Aristotle gave us, and they applied it to human sexuality as they understood sexuality given their faith, their moral faith. Therefore, everything in nature has a purpose. Human sexuality is therefore meant to procreate. It may be pleasurable, but that's not the purpose of it. It's to procreate. And therefore, there's a central feature, a defining aspect of procreation that allows for procreation, and obviously that's intercourse between a male of the species and a female of the species, between a man and a woman. And therefore, the proper good that's developed from that is that we use our sexual organs in the way that allows for reproduction so the species can continue. In other words, traditional sexual morality says that sex is between a man and a woman. And any other sexual activity, not between a man and a woman, because it cannot result in the reproduction of the species, must be immoral. Also, in order to have procreation of the species, you must have a family unit that not only gives birth to the child, but raises the child with the same moral understanding and moral instincts so that when they become of age, both sexually, intellectually, and morally, they can contribute themselves to the procreation of the species as well. So according to traditional sexual morality, we use our body parts for one reason, and that's to procreate the race. Therefore, sexual activity can only be between a man and a woman, and it has to be done solely for the purpose of procreating the race. Because we need a man and a woman to produce a child, we also need a man and woman to raise the child in the moral atmosphere necessary to continue the procreation of the species, so intercourse can only occur within the bonds of matrimony. The night before, no, that would not be moral. It has to be within the bonds of matrimony. You have to be married. No same-sex marriages. This is just immoral as far as the church is concerned. And again, they are using the foundation of their thinking. They go back to Aristotle and his teleological explanation of nature, that everything in nature has a purpose. There's an essential or defining characteristic that allows for that purpose, and therefore there's a proper good that has to be employed in order to allow for that defining feature to be used properly so that we can have the reproduction of the species.